Thanks for joining me today. I'm Sean from Van Lee Community Church. Today we're going to be beginning our study of the book of Philemon by looking at the background of the book. Next week we'll be working our way through the book, reading the verses. But today, just so for those of you who maybe aren't quite as familiar with the book, you'll have a little bit of an idea of where the book is coming from. So let's go ahead and get started here. Just initially, I've always found the book of Philemon to be interesting because of all the books in the Bible, it stands out in a couple of ways. First off, it's very short. It's only 25 verses long, which would have been about the normal length of a letter written in Roman times, and of course that's what the book of Philemon initially was. It was a letter from Paul, the apostle, to Philemon, a Christian who lived in the city of Colossae, which is in Asia Minor. The second reason it stands out is, of all the books in the Bible, it may be the most subversive book, culturally subversive book you'll run into. And I mean that in the very best way possible. The reason it's so subversive is because it stands for the idea that the gospel of Jesus Christ is for everyone, for every person. There's no person whose station in life makes them ineligible to receive the gospel of Jesus Christ. And in a culture like the Roman culture, that was a slaveholding society and ruled by an elite, the idea that the gospel was for everyone, and that when we become Christians, we're brothers and sisters in Christ, with equal value to God, that wouldn't have been just controversial, that would have been absolutely subversive. And I think even in our time, even in our culture, it's still challenging. We should each find it challenging, because I think it's easy to fall into the trap that the idea that there are certain people who maybe can't be saved, maybe shouldn't be saved. So I think we find that challenging. So let's dig in a little bit to what more about the book of Philemon. So first off, good starting point is authorship. Who wrote the book of Philemon? And that, thankfully, is a pretty easy answer. The book of Philemon was written by the Apostle Paul. With authorship of the books of the New Testament, sometimes it's uncertain who wrote the books, or who wrote particular books of the Bible. But Philemon is one of the letters, one of the books in the New Testament where it's never been in question who wrote it. Paul wrote it, and in fact, within the text of the book itself, it says that Paul, not only did Paul write it, Paul wrote it with his own hand. So we can be pretty sure that Paul wrote the book. And when he wrote it probably right around 60 A.D., maybe a couple years later. But within the text of the book, it says that Paul refers to himself as a prisoner of Christ, and so that would probably be an indication that probably he's writing from Rome. Whether he was being held in prison at the time or being held under house arrest, we can't say for sure, but it's probably more likely he was under house arrest, given the context of what else we read in the letter. He lists a handful of associates who are there with him. That would be indicative of him being held under house arrest. So from there, there's going to be three main people we're going to run into in the book of Philemon. First, of course, is Paul. Paul, if you're not familiar, is an apostle. Initially, he started off as an adversary of Christ, an adversary of Christianity. He was a Pharisee. He started off persecuting Christians. When Stephen, the first martyr of Christianity, was stoned to death, Paul was there. He was cheering on the crowd that was stoning him, and he was watching over their coats, so no one stole their coats. You read about that in Acts chapter 7. Additionally, but he didn't stay there. He was zealous in persecuting Christians. The one thing you can say about Paul, before he was a Christian and after he became a Christian, he was always zealous. He never took half measures. He was always all in, no matter what he was doing. So if you read in Acts chapter 9, Paul was again attempting to persecute Christians, traveling from Jerusalem to Damascus. He had a literal Damascus Road experience. He was confronted by the risen Christ, and he converted. He became a Christian there, went to Damascus. The gospel was given to him. He accepted, and from that moment on, Paul transformed from a zealous persecutor of Christians to a zealous proponent of Christianity. He became one of the great evangelists of world history, but particularly in the New Testament period. He's one of the great evangelists, if not the greatest evangelist. He went from persecuting Christians to planting churches all over the Mediterranean. And so the second person we're going to run into is Philemon. Philemon is the person this letter is directed to. So Philemon is a church leader in the city of Colossae, and if you're not familiar, that's fine. Colossae was a Roman city in Asia Minor. So think modern Western Turkey. And so Philemon was relatively wealthy, hosted in his home a house church. So there was a house church that actually met in Philemon's home. And so that would lead one to believe that he wasn't simply a Christian, he was probably a relatively important leader in the local church. But beyond that, he was also a slaveholder. Philemon was a Christian who owned human beings. If you're thinking those two don't go together, you're right. That's kind of what this letter is getting at. And then the third person we're going to run into here is Onesimus. So Onesimus is his name. Sometimes when you read the Bible, it's kind of interesting because the names sometimes have a meaning that's relevant to the person, sometimes describing them, sometimes describing the opposite, and it can be kind of a humorous play on words. But here, Onesimus, his name means useful. And Onesimus was a slave who was owned by Philemon. And now Onesimus was living in Colossae, owned by Philemon, and he escaped. He ran away from Philemon and traveled all the way from Colossae to Rome, where he ran into Paul. And Onesimus at that point became a Christian. And so at the time that Paul is writing this letter, Onesimus is a new convert to Christianity, and Paul is writing this letter to Philemon on behalf of Onesimus. And something else that's interesting about Philemon after this account, later on after this letter was written, Philemon actually became a leader in his local church, went on to become a bishop. So one of the scenarios I've always thought was interesting is that before Onesimus was a Christian, he was a slave and Philemon was his master. But a while later, it's quite likely that Onesimus, as a bishop in the church, was actually a leader over Philemon. So I think that dynamic has always struck me as interesting. And the idea of Onesimus becoming a bishop wouldn't have been unusual in the early church at all. One of the unique things about the early church is that it appealed to outcasts. So whereas a lot of the Roman religion and a lot of the other polytheistic religions had people who were in and people who were out. People who were acceptable and people who weren't acceptable. And so if you were a slave, if you were a woman, if you weren't from the right ethnic group, you were excluded from most of the particular religions. So, an example, the Roman religion was led by a group, would have been led by a group of priests who were dedicated to that the polytheistic religion of the Roman Empire, and led by a person whose title was led by a person whose title had actually been subsumed into one of the imperial titles during the time of Julius Caesar. So, at any rate, the fact that Philemon became a bishop would not have been unusual at the time. One of the great bishops, some of you may have heard of, particularly if you come from a Catholic tradition, would be Clement I. He was a bishop of Rome. He's considered one of the first popes by the Roman Catholic Church. He actually was a slave in the first century during this time period. So, just getting at is this dynamic in the church would not have been unusual at the time. It's something that Paul was very eager to get sorted out because within the church, within Christianity, we're all brothers and sisters in Christ, and all people are valuable to God. We're all created in the image of God. The term is imago Dei. We all bear the image of God. And the idea of one person owning another, one person treating another poorly, viewing another person as less valuable than himself would have been repugnant to Christianity. So, the themes we see here, again, first, the gospel is for all people and each person is valuable. And that idea in that period in time would have been very, very controversial. It would have even been borderline treasonous because not only did people hold slaves in the Roman Empire, the Roman Empire had state-owned slaves, and a third of the empire's population was enslaved. And so that's where Christianity really got going. Is they didn't the early church, they didn't go they didn't really specifically target the elite, the powerful. Although there were attempts to evangelize them, no doubt, but the early church never forgot those who were in need, never forgot the downtrodden and the underclass. That was where the church made inroads immediately. And so even today, that can be a challenging idea because there's a tendency to think that certain people maybe aren't good enough to be saved, maybe shouldn't be saved. But at the end of the day, the gospel is available to everyone. When Christ came to earth and died on the cross, he paid the penalty. He paid the penalty for everyone's sin. It made the gift of salvation available to everyone. And when we don't when we don't preach that, when we preach the gospel as something that's only available to certain people, or give the impression that it's only available to certain people, we do a disservice to Christ. So Paul, in writing this letter, really conveys the idea, puts application to an idea he taught in Galatians. So in Galatians chapter 3, verses 28 through 29, he says, "There is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. If you belong to Christ, you are Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise." So if we take that and apply that to this situation, then obviously Philemon has a problem with the way he's treating Onesimus, and Paul gives some instructions on how to deal with that, which I think that we'll talk about more in coming weeks. So with that, I hope you're if you didn't know much about the book of Philemon, I hope you've learned a little bit more today. And I hope you're interested in follow along the next few weeks as we work our way through the book. Thanks for joining me today, and have a good day.